Hey all, Dave here. Welcome to something a little bit different. In this video, we're going to be discussing this book, which you probably can't see very well, but it's Seven Types of Atheism by John Gray. And it's an interesting little book that Rev recommended to me. And welcome, Rev. Thanks for joining me and for recommending the book. You might recognize Rev from the discussion that we had with him on the Answers in Reason channel. How's life treating you?
Not too shabby here in Tennessee there, Dave. We're hanging in there and crack-a-lacking right along.
Nice one. Do you want to just tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've definitely been a fan of the Answers and Reasons folks and have talked to them, on their stream and also in messages for the past few years now, harassing Dave to the point of almost probably figuring out what kind of restraining order he needs across the ocean.
It's never harassment.
But I basically very interested in philosophy and also the philosophy of religion. And I was raised in a Christian home, but sort of one of the oddball Christianities, Christian Science. So never been real dogmatic about a lot of the standard Christian go-tos like heaven, hell, or the need of Jesus to die for my sins and all of that kind of stuff. So it's been more of a very almost kind of like what they would consider like a more Gnostic approach, where the goal was to understand God rather than, follow the teachings of the church or things like that, just understanding the nature of God. And I just sort of kind of faded away from that. And while I definitely believe that there are no gods, I'm also interested in the function that religion plays and the importance it has for some people, and also the need for spirituality and the need for faith in whatever a person chooses to have faith in. And so ultimately finding, common grounds with people, especially in a political situation, to put God belief in its proper box where it doesn't become the first and foremost point of disagreement.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in most cases, we have more in common with, say, a Christian than we have less in common.
Yeah, for sure. And now there's certainly some of them that I don't line up with on just about anything, but I'm in a very, very decided minority here in the deep South here. So you got to find your allies where you can find your allies. And and also too, extending the grace for people to find their truths and the truths that they're looking for on their time, just like I had. So just because I realize something, okay, this is probably the way it is, you got to give people the time and whatever they need to get to that place as well.
And we're all just looking to live our lives as best as possible. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What made you grab this?
I was just thinking about that, and I was reading a thread on, I think it was like pantheism or something, which I still don't understand, but something of that nature. And this John Gray's fella came up and he was talking about secular humanism in kind of a negative way, which I always thought secular humanism, that sounds pretty nice. Why would you be against that? And I kind of went down a rabbit hole, and he's wrote a book called Straw Dogs, which is probably his most famous publication. But this book popped up, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is something I think Dave would really be interested in. And I read through the first 3 chapters and then thought, this would be, a good thing to kind of talk about and, get a fresh perspective rather than, all the regurgitation on the Twitter and on the YouTube, and from somebody obviously that is very schooled in philosophy and is really not doesn't have a real, pony in the whole God debate.
Yeah, it's I'm very glad you introduced me to it. I started reading the introduction and then ended up reading the introduction, the New Atheism chapter and the Secular Humanism chapter all in one afternoon. And I thought I better stop because I really need to go, like read it properly and take notes and all that. Once you get reading it, it's a very different kind of book on atheism.
No, it for sure is, and you've read more books on it than I am, but it's not coming from an angle of arguing about does God exist. So it's a
Yeah.
fairly, it's not a large book. It's what, like 170 pages or so.
Yeah, it's like dead tiny.
Yeah, and while it is, I would say, a person that doesn't have a super strong philosophical background, it helps to definitely know some of the terms and some of the philosophers he refers to, or various people, but it's not overwhelming, and I think some
Yeah.
of these books can get, for a person like myself that isn't schooled in this, it can get overwhelming pretty fast. So
Oh yeah, yeah.
um, his writing style is certainly academic and educated, but not writing past people.
Not stifling or stuffy or anything like that.
Yeah, and definitely, again, not the same, a different spin on the same arguments of the God existence and the problems with religion and whatnot. It's
Yeah.
really kind of just looking at what atheism is, and that's something, Dave, where you've definitely talked about, where it doesn't need to be another book on definition of the word.
Yeah, yeah. And that's one thing I like about it. And it's something that people should know because there's probably going to be a lot of people watching this now going, there's only one definition of atheism. There's only one type of atheism. But he's not talking about how we define the word. He's talking about practical applications of how atheists live. So he kind of defines it as an atheist as someone with no need for not even belief in creator, but living as if a creator exists and gives us revelation. You did some amazing notes, and I'm just trying to find the section. Atheism is not the same as the rejection of religion, but
I have his definition here if you want me to.
yes, please.
Okay, and this is a direct excerpt from the text. He says, "So I suggest that an atheist is anyone with no use for the idea of a divine mind that has fashioned the world. In this sense, atheism does not amount to very much. It is simply the absence of the idea of a creator God." And that's his definition, which he uses in this book, which I think we need to respect,
Yeah.
for the discussion of the text.
And that's how he works out these seven types of atheism. It's living without the need for this divine mind and proceeding as if, none of that exists. And it sort of fits the lack of belief definition to some degree, but it's not quite that. It's a little bit more.
Yeah, because I certainly lack a belief in God or a creator God, but also I would take it a step further, that I have considered it and have no use for it as well. So doesn't have to be anything more, but also you're not putting people that have never considered it in that boat either. It's someone that says, I understand what this is, I don't have any use for this. That's all it needs to be.
And Nietzsche sort of argues something similar. It's atheism is more about casting off these old traditions and living our lives and redefining the values that we have, not in terms of needing a divine mind, but looking more to the future, putting humanity out there and trusting in ourselves and all that kind of stuff. He sort of talks about that in the Secular Humanism chapter that I read, but we'll discuss that more in that chapter. And one thing I do like in the intro as well is he sort of separates religion from just belief in God, or say just from Christianity.
Yeah,
Because
yeah. And one thing he says is that, for most, and this is an excerpt as well, for most human beings, religion has always consisted of practices more than beliefs. So
Yeah.
this is where we get like your cultural religious people and observance. So, back in the day, it didn't matter if you believed, it would matter, did you show up and do the observance? Did you
Yeah.
do the traditions? Did you do your belief really doesn't come into play until, and he makes this point, until Christianity shows up. And now it's about belief.
Yeah, it's putting your belief in Jesus's resurrection and Jesus is the Son of God. But prior to that, like Judaism was a collection of rituals, and you find that in, say, the Far Eastern religions as well.
Yeah.
And he discusses that.
Yeah. And also the Romans and the polytheistic religions, it was, or in a lot of indigenous, religions, it's customs, and that's a big issue with people that want to cast off religion. In a lot of places, you're casting out their culture and their identity, which,
Yeah.
so not all religion is about belief.
No, no. I mean, even to some extent, Christianity isn't just about belief. It's about the unity of morals and like the community aspect of it and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, you can definitely have, a cultural Christians that, show up to funerals, show up to weddings, show up to baptisms because you want to celebrate the birth of a child, with a
Yeah.
family and do all of that. And, however you do the ceremony, people can fuss and, they shouldn't stick infants under the water and whatnot. But, the idea of just everybody showing up and, blessing, like even if
Yeah.
you just, you can have a sense of, the power is greater than us, bless this event or whatever, and
Yeah.
you don't have to get, it could be just something you observe or recognize rather than believe in.
Yeah, and it is something that sort of Nietzsche talks about. He says, killing off God, it removes a lot of purpose and a lot of ritual from people, and without thinking of ways of replacing that kind of thing, that's what will rip people into nihilism. And I think he kind of captures that idea quite well in the intro when he discusses the rituals and stuff like that. Because, like he also mentions in the intro, a lot of people seem to, or a lot of atheists today seem to think that religion is just belief. Religion is like that kind of thing, but it's more than that. It's about finding meaning, discovering purpose, and stuff like that.
Yeah, and one of the things that that I learned on Twitter is that when you conflate and you try to make a statement about, this one, like a Greg Locke kind of pastor, right? And then you
Yeah,
just put theists on it, right? Then you're really dragging a lot of people that are opposed to him. You say this is what I disagree with specifically, and not try to make it the broad spectrum of every sort of religion or God belief.
yeah,
And then once you start, attacking the Jewish religion and cultures, then all the Nazis show up. And
yeah,
and so you got to be careful about that kind of stuff and sort of back off of just attacking religion and calling it all whatever, like fantasy or magic or Harry Potter and stuff like that. When
yeah.
it's a big part of who a person is.
It is. Like you were saying earlier, when you're removing religion, you're not just removing a belief or a viewpoint of the world, you're removing an actual identity.
Yeah. And one other quote that he makes that kind of grabbed me a little bit is that he says, while atheists may call themselves free thinkers, for many today, atheism is a closed system of thought.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and I've talked about this in the past as well.
Yeah, and that kind of segues into the idea that another point he makes throughout the book is that atheism has become, fills the void that religion left for these folks. So
Yeah,
folks, come in, take the same sort of attitude, approach, and mindset with their atheism. So just as their previous belief structure might have been very closed and this is the way it is, and I don't have any reason to open my mind to anything else, they carry that same sort of mindset and get really, really influenced by monotheistic type of thoughts,
Yeah.
especially Christianity.
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. I don't want to say they still have their own pastors and their own preachers because that's not quite right, but they still have certain authorities that are unquestionable and
Yeah,
certain dogmas that if you question, then, they go on the attack.
yeah, they certainly have their leaders, and the leaders certainly have their followers. I
Yeah.
mean, make no question of that. That's for sure. And you definitely see that sort of dynamic, and they go just as unquestioned as someone reading a sermon or because if it wasn't, people would be reading more books like this rather than relying on YouTube. And I understand that at some point this will probably end up on YouTube. So go read the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah, I agree.
You know,
And that's one of the worst things about it is the people who really should be reading it the most probably will reject it outright because of that same sort of dogmatic mindset that they bring with them from their previous religion.
Yeah, yeah, and one last quote I had that I really liked was he says, "The idea that human species realizes common goals throughout history is a secular avatar of a religious idea of redemption."
Yeah.
So there again, you're taking a very Christian-inspired idea and then just kind of making it secular. And so
Yeah.
instead of a divine hand, it's the hand of humanity. Same
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. And I think to some extent, a lot of people, a lot of sort of I don't want to call them new atheists because it's not quite what they are, but they're new to atheism.
Right.
They don't quite understand what secular means. They think secular is simply removing all religion from all aspects of life, but that's not quite what secular is supposed to mean. It's supposed to mean, none of them taking precedent or taking the forefront. And it's about kind of living together with religions and allowing people to be who they are.
Right, right. Yeah, it's not just because again, the idea that we can remove religion or that we will at some point is something that, someone would have to demonstrate to me how that's going to happen.
Yeah,
You shouldn't just take it on face value. That even I read a book by Professor Susan Jacoby, and it was about titled something to the effect of the history of secularism in the United States, and she makes it clear like, hey, the United States has had, 3 to 4 great awakenings. All
yeah,
of this stuff happens in cycles. And we think like, okay, we're eliminating, religion and then it's going down, eventually it'll go away. No, it'll eventually ramp back up again because something will happen that'll drive people back to churches. And that's
yeah,
just what's happened historically. And again, we wouldn't have great awakenings if there wasn't the movement away from the churches. And like slavery, the Civil War was definitely one of them. And also sometimes, and again, there was big secular movements in like the 18th century, in the 19th century, where that became like a thing, and people don't understand like secularism didn't start with YouTube.
no. It's something that slowly come about, and like he points out in the book, even the people spearheading those secular movements ended up creating their own kinds of religion.
Yeah, and some intentionally. There
Yeah.
was one guy he was talking about that made his own religion, and they had to wear these clothes that they couldn't put on themselves. So it was to build, I guess, the bonding experience of dressing.
Altruism.
Yeah,
Yeah.
altruism. Yeah,
What's his name?
which seems like a
Pomodri?
kind of a weird way to do that, but you
Yeah.
know, so
Man.
instead of doing the fall backwards sort of thing, we're gonna dress each other. That I'd probably just let's go back to the falling backward. I'll take my chances that you don't catch me. But yeah, so they intentionally realizing that you're not going to get rid of religion, intentionally create rituals to promote, the things that they were, they couldn't get away from.
Yeah. Sorry, I've just looked him up. It's Albert Comte, the guy who created the positivist movement originally, or, well,
Yeah.
kind of spearheaded it. Yeah.
Now, what exactly does positivism mean? 'Cause you see that a lot in this book, and then that's a term that I wasn't entirely familiar with.
Yeah, he kind of talks about the history of it, but he never really actually explains what it is. And it's basically the idea that the only type of knowledge that we can get is from things that are true by definition, or the say 1 + 1 = 2. We can know that because it doesn't take anything else, or we can only have knowledge through something like empirical findings. So introspection can't get us any knowledge. Sort of rationalism can't get us any knowledge. It's basically what you kind of see among atheists on Twitter and YouTube at the moment. If there's no evidence, then we can't know. I mean, I heard something recently from Matt Dillahunty where he said if you ask somebody for directions to a restaurant and they give you directions, you can't know that the restaurant is there until you actually get to the restaurant. And that's sort of positivist outlook. So testimony can't give you knowledge because it's not empirical and it's not tested. You can't have knowledge until you've tested something. So basically science or empiricism.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's, and that's, the author, John Gray, definitely kind of steers away from that.
Yeah. I mean, I do. I don't think that kind of thing is the only way to get knowledge. I mean, with an argument like that, you would have to show empirical evidence to show that's the only way you could have knowledge.
Right.
So it's a sort of self-defeating movement.
Yeah,
And that's
for sure.
basically what happened to the movement, is it was shown to be sort of self-defeating. And, what he says about Comte, he was a very smart guy, but he was also semi-deranged.
Yeah.
That was funny.
Yeah.
I actually chuckled out loud, yeah.
Yeah, he'd fit right in today on the YouTube, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So is positivism, is that the same as when they say like knowledge inherently leads to good?
No, not that I know of.
Or is that just something that people that kind of like, we have this sort of faith that by accumulating knowledge, we can only go to good?
Yeah, that's not strictly positivism.
Right.
If we, the accumulation of knowledge is something that's good because it means we know more, but knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to good. Like you were pointing out just before we actually started recording, the Nazis had lots of knowledge. Didn't necessarily lead to good.
No, in fact, quite the opposite, if I recall my history correctly. And and that's definitely a where science needs a check. And I was reading another book on eugenics in the 20th century, and the people, science, the Supreme Court made a famous decision where they voted 8-1, and Oliver Wendell Holmes said 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. And it was the Catholic Church that was basically came up and said, we don't have the science on this like y'all do, but maybe cutting everyone's junk off isn't right. And if it wasn't for them, that in making people stop and realize what they were doing was wrong. And again, their science at the time was flawed and also just not right. And then the people's application of it, because they sat around and they were like, well, we got to get rid of all the imbeciles, which was a scientific term at the time. And, they said, well, who's an imbecile is the poor people, because why would you be poor? That's kind of dumb. So they're like, okay, let's round up all the poor people. And then they were like, who else is really kind of dumb? Is Italians. And And then they were like, sure, why not? And then
Yeah.
women that enjoy sex, how crazy is that? So they started, doing that, and then meanwhile it was literally the Catholic Church was going, yeah, well, this is not, and I'm not saying their motivations were wholly good either, but they definitely pushed back on that and stopped it. And then meanwhile, whether you think Hitler was a Christian or Hitler was an atheist, the one thing that is for sure is that he definitely took the science that was developed at that time and ran with it, and then
Yeah.
pushed it even to other levels. So, the idea that science, is going to answer all of humanity's problems is, and which is another thing that John Gray says is religion isn't meant to tell us how the universe came to be. It's how we find meaning in the
Yeah.
universe, which science can't do.
Yeah.
So we're going to search for meaning as much as we're going to search for truth. And maybe some people search for knowledge more than they search for meaning, and some people search for meaning more. But that's part of what religion has done for humans over the centuries is search for meaning.
Yeah. And it's given a lot of people meaning.
Yeah.
There's not, that can't be denied. I think he mentions it if I remember right, he mentions it in the book, but Wittgenstein talks about this as well. You can have science answer all the questions related to how the universe is, but it'll still leave a whole bunch of unanswered questions for the average human being.
Yeah. And that's again where religion does not boil down to, does God exist? Yes or no? Please check one.
Yeah.
It's way more than that, and people will and everybody needs to search for meaning on their own terms. That's the other thing. Just because some knowledge has been acquired somewhere doesn't mean that this person, he should have the grace to find the meaning and the truth and answer his questions the same way everybody else did.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's kind of why I like the book. He speaks about, for like a lot of the new atheists, it was about getting rid of religion and hating religion. But there's also the other atheists who are happy to just let religions be and let people find their own kind of meaning. They're happy to find their meaning in the beauty of the universe. Like a lot of atheists are happy to just find their meaning in their little circles or...
Yeah.
I kind of like that approach, and I think that's why I think a lot of atheists should be reading this book, because it shows that it's not just this conflict. It doesn't just have to be this conflict anyway.
Right. Well, do you want to go ahead and so John Gray basically breaks the book down. There's an introduction, of course, and then there's 7 chapters, one for each type of atheism. And coincidentally, in the copy that you rented from the library, your library had 7 copies. I'm sure one for each of the atheists, so they didn't have to, squabble over it.
They could just they could just read their chapter.
Yeah. And then move on. But he identifies, and this is again his identification and his labels: 7 types of atheism. The first being new atheism, which is what most people are familiar with these days. Your Dawkins, Harris, etc. The second type would be secular humanism, which we'll discuss that when we get there. The third would be religions made from science, like a scientism. And again, I know like a lot of folks are hardwired to thinking that science can't be a religion, but wait, there's more. The fourth would be modern political religions, which Nazism, communism, and other secular type beliefs. The fifth is the atheism of God haters, which is, I think the word is like misotheism.
Misotheism, yeah.
Yeah, which would be, and neither Dave or I have read all these chapters yet, so we're gonna learn them as we go. The sixth type of atheism is folks that reject the idea of a creator God without having any sort of piety towards humanity or a faith in the eventual goodness of humanity. He lists like Joseph Conrad, if anyone's familiar with him, or George Santayana, maybe. I'm not familiar with either one of those guys, but
No, I'm not.
those are two examples. And then basically the seventh would be mystical atheism of Spinoza, Schopenhauer, a God that transcends any sort of human conception. So basically, there is a God out there. However, maybe an equivalent would be like expecting, a person having an ant farm and expecting the ants to understand, their, creator or their higher power. So, and that's again something I've seen those names for sure, but I have never read any of their books. But basically, a God that we are just entirely able to discuss or comprehend.
Yeah, I suppose it's kind of like Aquinas. God is so unlike anything that we could imagine that we can't even begin to comprehend him. And
Yeah, yeah, and that's something again where if we can't comprehend it, then there's really no point in us pretending we can argue about it.
yeah,
And then he closes by saying, "I have no interest in converting anyone to or from any of these types of atheism, but my own preferences will be clear. Repelled by the first five varieties, I am drawn to the last two atheisms that are happily to live with a godless world or an unnameable God."
yeah, yeah. I mean, I kind of prefer the idea of a godless world simply because learning to make our own meaning and learning to get along and learning that everybody has to find their own meanings and treat other people well. Sometimes God belief can interfere with that. But I'm also happy to live with people who want to believe in this God, want to find meaning
Right,
with this God, but don't want to use it as like a club to beat people down with.
right,
And as
right,
far as I'm
and
concerned, most religious people aren't like that. The very vocal ones are.
yeah,
But most religious people I know are just happy to be themselves and let you be you.
yeah, yeah, and I think it's important to definitely address the American evangelical and not loop him in with an Eastern Asian philosopher. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's or people that are just performing ritual out of tradition. Again, different than the guy with the Trump rally and screaming at people.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that part I'm not happy with, and that part I don't want to. But you can't address that part effectively when you just say theists or put everything in that box. And like I like to point out to folks in America that, and especially if you're on the what I like to call the American side, the left side, we wouldn't have controlled the Senate in the last election if it wasn't for a black pastor in Georgia and the effort made through all of those churches there. We would have been even a bigger mess if that hadn't happened. So you have to realize that you have to recognize your allies and give them
Yeah.
credit when they step up and do the right thing. And then we can sit and have a discussion about God, but if other things happen, then perhaps we'll lose that ability. So
Yeah.
what scares you more?
Yeah, that's it. And I think because I think a lot of the sort of, again, by new atheists here, I'm not speaking of sort of the Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins type, but those that are new to atheism, they're still kind of lashing out. They still conflate the religion that they've just left with the whole of religion, and they're lashing out, and they're still just very angry at what they think is being deceived. And they end up just kind of being angry at every religious person. I suppose it's when you break free from something, you want to set everybody else free, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I do think in a way nature abhors a vacuum, and it's like if we quit one bad habit, like say for example perhaps smoking, you replace it with eating maybe or
Yeah.
whatever, and I think sometimes we replace something's got to fill that void, right? And I
Yeah.
think if people are realizing that and looking at their actions, replace it with something that's positive. And if you're appalled at your former church's behavior, acting appalling, why should anyone consider you any different? After
Yeah.
that's not a good look. So replace what you left behind with something like reading a book, or something
Yeah.
like that. Look at that. And I think people, you always say, you can take the tiger out of the jungle, but you can't take the jungle out of the tiger. And it's sort of
Yeah.
that sort of.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean that they could replace that with reading this and learning a bit.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And instead of just like there's only one kind of atheism and that shouldn't exist, because and I would say, we identify groups of Christians. There's the evangelicals, there's the groups that you group them by their actions and their beliefs and their what the impacts that they have.
Yeah.
So the same is going to be true with atheists, and any sort of religion. You're going to have so many different types. Same with atheism. It's just
Oh
the way
yeah,
it is.
yeah, definitely. And it depends on sort of the groups that you exist in, the circles that you center yourself around, what you believe is important about atheism. All those things will affect the type of atheism that you bring in a practical sense to the world.
Yeah, yeah, and again, this is more about your actions and your that's what puts you in this box, not your beliefs.
Yeah. And like you say, it's the same with religion.
Yeah,
I mean, you find that in Hinduism. Even Taoism has different groups of behaviors. Christianity, definitely. But I mean, even paganism or, like Norse
yeah,
paganism, you can find different ideas within those groups.
yeah, for sure.
We probably should talk about the New Atheism chapter, thinking about it. I mean, we
Yeah,
have, but mention some of the stuff that he talks about. Like, I think he raises a really good point where a lot of that type of atheist makes the mistake of seeing religion as another hypothesis to explain the universe,
right.
when really it's not.
Yeah, yeah, and historically, folks like he points out, like Augustine and Philo basically said, you can Augustine was like, as our knowledge increases, we can treat this more as a myth or metaphor, but it wasn't intended to, be a book that Darwin, it wasn't our first crack at evolution of the species. Basically, it wasn't
Yeah,
Genesis. And again, it's people searching for meaning in their existence, and also their particular. And I've also read, like, a lot of belief is that Genesis is a story that was probably written while they were in captivity, and it's giving people the idea that God will recreate what they had, out of the void, or out of the nothing. When their temples and homes got ransacked and taken away, God
yeah,
will provide for them. So again, it was a story more of meaning rather than now what confuses that is you got the ding dongs out there like Ken Ham that are treating the Bible as a science book, and those people
yeah,
are very vocal and also very attackable too. That's the other
yeah,
thing. So when you want to go after a guy like him, who makes very easy statements to refute, that are scientifically based, then yeah, that's easy to go after. If someone just says, look, Genesis is a metaphor, it's a way to understand how we came to be, there's not a lot you can do with that. You can just say, well, I don't believe it. Okay, fine. But you can't really argue it.
no, that's it. And I mean, if you go back to ancient Jewish literature, you can find it being treated as mythological rather than factual.
Yeah,
A lot of the atheists today kind of forget that.
yeah. and again, focusing on, and I understand that, because I remember, in the 90s there was a big push to put creationism as a science and have it taught in
Yeah.
schools, and saying, no, this isn't religious or mythical or anything. This is actual, something that some people believe in. The earth is millions of years old, and then some people believe that it's 6,000 years old. When, historically, you look through books and books and books, you're not going to have a lot of people arguing that the earth itself is 6,000 years old. Now, they may use that timeline to sort of like the history of humanity, but people just didn't care so much about how old the earth was. If it was a million, a billion, 10,000, whatever, way before I was here. So that's good enough. But it
Yeah.
makes it a very fun debate, a lot of drama, but it's not really doing anything more than just, kind of satisfying people's need for that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think that's a sort of excellent point that he brings up in that first chapter on New Atheism. It very much is like a recycling of the debates of the 1800s. And
Yeah.
we constantly see these same debates being brought back up, and it's the same arguments, and it's missing the point again. It's trying to provide scientific evidence to disprove something that isn't really even based on scientific evidence anyway, and isn't trying to do that.
Yeah, and then of course, speaking to just Christianity, he makes the point: the real conflict is not between religion and science, but between Christianity and history.
Yeah.
And that's, a great point, is that, Christianity is is more susceptible to history than it is to science.
Yeah.
And there again, the problem with history is that evidence and proof is a whole different ball of wax than it is over in the science field.
Yeah.
And all we're going to get in history is evidence. That's it. You're never going to
Yeah.
get proof that this or this didn't happen. All you can have is evidence. And then,
Yeah.
the best conclusions based off of that. But rather than pitting science against religion, more Christianity versus history.
Yeah, and Christianity probably is the most acceptable religion to that kind of thing, except like maybe Islam or Mormonism, because they're in living history, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, if your religion is based off of traditions or just philosophies, again, history doesn't play much of a part of that either.
No,
You can
no.
just agree or disagree with them.
Yeah, they're making different kinds of claims, those kind of religions. Whereas something like Islam, he doesn't really talk about it, but Islam has the same thing. Muhammad actually did certain events in history, like splitting the moon in two, and that leaves it open to a very different kind of attack. In other words, it's not a religion just about ritual. It's a religion about this person speaks for God, therefore you should follow him. He had these events happen in history, and that's what proves it. But I think even for a lot of Christians or Muslims, that stuff doesn't really matter. What matters is the meaning it gives them and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And he has another real good quote here, too, that where he says, religion may involve the creation of illusions, but there is nothing in science that said illusion may not be useful, even indispensable in life. The human mind is programmed for survival, not for truth.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's sort of that argument from Alvin Plantinga that, if we're created by God, we're created for truth, and evolution argues that we're created for survival. So going from evolution, illusions are a big part of what has kept us alive for such a long time. Religion might be an illusion, but it has helped to unify entire cultures and groups of people. Like the classic example of illusion being something that we accept as a good survival mechanism is the rustling in the bush.
Yeah. Yeah. And
You
that
know,
still shakes us up when we hear that. It definitely does. And he addresses, and I suspect will in future chapters, that there is this idea that humanity in its infancy goes from religion and then through science and then eventually knowledge, like, well, we'll
Yeah.
just know everything. And there's a number of things, where Gray touches on and says, first of all, maybe, that's not necessarily true, but also too, knowledge doesn't inherently lead us to a good place. And the idea that, and I think Sam Harris is the one that he says the American New Atheist Sam Harris wants a science of good and evil. He assumes that this science will support liberal values of human equality and personal autonomy. Why it should do so is never explained.
Yeah, it's just taken on faith that it will. Like,
Yes.
science is just seen as this savior for humanity. So whatever I find to be good is what science is going to give me.
Yeah. And that goes back to what he was saying with, the faith in science or the faith in humanity replacing the faith in the divine for retribution or salvation. Is that
Yeah.
the idea that I think if you truly move away from the God belief, then maybe you shouldn't have faith in any of that, right?
Yeah.
Not just shifting from faith in God to faith in science, or and at the end of the day, a faith in religion is man-made, as atheists will be quick to point out, but so is science. And
Yeah.
they're both susceptible to be used and abused. And you can find the faith in science to be cringy.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily lead to good things. And he later makes a point where you could have an oppressed minority, and then through progress they can't vote, right? But then through you make progress, and then now these people can vote, but then they all get together and unify and change the Constitution to take away the right to vote from the other people. So
Yeah.
so you had some progress, but then you ended right back up in the same place. And so it's a matter of perspective, but movement isn't always progress.
No. And it is something he mentions that I really agree with. Like, we always have this idea that we have progressed, and it's usually based on, say, the medicines that we now have. We've extended our lifespans. We have better living accommodations.
Right.
But there's still a lot of slavery in the world.
Yep.
Still a lot of racism, still a lot of hate. There's areas where we have made progress, in areas where we haven't. And like you were saying before, it's all kind of cyclical.
Yep. And I've always felt like we have the resources to end hunger immediately,
Yeah.
and we don't. So I remember as a kid collecting pennies for UNICEF to feed the famine stricken people in Africa or Asia. And now with all the advances that we've made, we're not even feeding all the people in our country,
Yeah.
and I assume yours. So
Yeah.
but it's not for a lack of knowledge or a lack of which may have been the case 200-300 years ago. So did the progress go? And again, that's not to shoot all over any progress that has been made or say nothing has gotten better, but the idea that these should be just blindly in like we'll develop more science, and then there will be no sickness, and then there will be, and again, that just sounds like God stuff, right? If we
It
get to
does.
a place where there's no sickness and no hunger and no poverty and no bigotry, that to me sounds like something a guy hears in church.
Yeah.
So
We're going to create our own new Garden of Eden kind of thing.
that's right. That's right. We just kind of said, we don't like this Olive Garden. We're going to go to the Garden of Olives, and
Yeah.
and kind of just slide it over a little bit and not really addressed anything. So and mostly his mentioning of the new atheism is that it's very much anti-religion, doesn't really address religion in a fair way, and makes it really conflates Christianity as religion
Yeah. Yeah.
or
It really
monotheism.
does. Yeah.
Yeah,
Monotheism, especially. I mean, that basically how it started was as a sort of reactionary movement to the Twin Towers attack and a reactionary movement to wanting to put creationism back in classes and that kind of thing. And it's understandable to want to do that, but they've created their own sort of crusade out of it, and they've turned it from reacting to those things to wanting to wipe out religion and conflating those things with the entirety of religion.
Right. And not taking the time to maybe say we've now put our faith in another bad box, or is removing religion in fact a good thing? Probably
Yeah.
not. I always think too, one thing when I hear a lot of anti-religion or anti-theist sort of, I always think of like the indigenous people of North America, and forcing them to, in Canada and in the United States, forcing them to, lose their dress, lose their
Yeah.
traditions, lose their religion, and how it just destroyed those people.
Yeah.
And I suppose you could say, well, you took them and gave them one religion and gave them another, but you made them lose their religion. And
Yeah.
it's just not like you're asking them to quit reading comic books or quit listening to Harry Potter or whatever. You're just, you're really removing their soul and
You're
what they
getting rid of
are.
the essence of what they are. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and that's what humans are, and it's not perfect, and again, it goes back to the idea that our brains are for survival, not for truth,
Yeah.
ultimately. So the religion may not make sense, but that's how those people survived for centuries until we showed up, doing their thing and
Yeah.
getting along with their struggles and fights with each other and whatnot. But you watch a couple shows like that, and you take a more sympathetic understanding of religion rather than they're delusional, or it's the people that won't accept reality. Because again, who's to say that exploring spirituality or exploring meaning, you ain't gonna find it in science.
Oh,
So
no, no.
where? And some people are gonna go down different paths. It's again extending a grace to people to be on their own path at their own pace.
Yeah. And it is important. And I think, like, he mentions in the book, a lot of atheists today are kind of born of the liberal movement, which itself is born from a kind of monotheism and kind of Christianity and Judaism. But a lot of them are born of this sort of liberal idea that everybody should be free to pave their own way, except when it comes to religion.
Yeah.
Then they're not allowed to pave their own way.
Yeah, and then there's a huge intolerance there, and I
Yeah.
I always remember, it's funny because there was, people always say like Dawkins and Harris and those other two, Hitchens. Saying Hitchens was a guy that I never cared for because of a lot of the political things he said. Like, I get
Yeah.
he's, was a smart guy and said a lot of very witty things, but very problematic. And along the lines of Hitchens, where I saw Hitchens though was like on the, like a lot of the daytime talk shows and those sorts of things. But before those guys on those, before we had the internet on, you'd have the daytime talk shows. Was that Madeline Murray O'Hare?
Yeah.
That's the first person that I remember in my lifetime as an atheist, and quite frankly, she was a terrible, terrible person, a horrible person, and you really made was repugnant with the way she handled people that didn't believe, and again, a lot of the things written down on a piece of paper I'd probably agree with, but also going after people's cultures, like in the Jewish community, and things like that, which opens up a whole nother level of racism and bigotry. It just opens the door to that, and something
Yeah.
I wish people would be just more careful of that. When you post your silly little meme about a Jewish tradition or practice, there's a whole level of badness behind that that's
Yeah.
way bigger than any of us need to be dealing with in a Twitter exchange.
Yeah.
And people need to be aware of that. But she was like the first one, and she's like largely not talked about today, and I think that that's good, because I again, in the thing she said, but the way it was done, the idea that new atheists are just people finally voicing their ideas, yeah, but it's also the sort of just basic brutish and unclassy way
The
they do it.
venom.
The
It's
venom,
the
yeah,
venom.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just attacking and attacking and attacking, and using the broadest of generalizations, and no sort of this or nothing, and
Yeah.
people aren't equipped to do it. No grace whatsoever. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember her, but back, when the daytime talk shows like Phil Donahue and whatnot were more of a thing, she'd make her rounds on that, and that was my first introduction to, like, I mean, like, I always knew people that were atheists that didn't believe in God, but they just basically didn't go to church, and
Yeah.
there was nothing remarkable about them one way or the other. And she was one that was kind of, like a standard bearer for the movement.
Made her a lot of money.
It
And
did,
cost
it did.
that
And then,
money cost her her life
yeah,
eventually.
and then tragically, like, her son and granddaughter as well. Yeah, and I think, there again, the idea that we're gonna be better, and like you were just pointing out, no, it became about money, just like a church. It
Yeah.
became about power, and whose message is better, and it really ended up not behaving itself any different than a big mega church with internal drama. So
Yeah.
the human element really is, it's often looked past but can't be ignored. And the idea that just by leaving a religion we're going to do things better than the religions do, you need to be able to demonstrate that.
Yeah. Same hand, different deck of cards, basically.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the extremism and the lack of compassion and grace, I guess I keep using that's where that's going to push towards, rather than just a better place. And I think
Yeah.
that was one of the big ideas from this. And again, reading it from this guy is going to be a lot more instructive than listening to me babble about it. But
And me.
yeah, I hope it at least strikes some interest. And there's people that are having these sorts of, that have looked at things and sort of put it all together, and rather
Yeah.
than just spouting off on it. He did have kind of, I liked how he ended up the first chapter. If it's all right with you, I'll go ahead and read that. He says, and this is how he ends the chapter on new atheism. Throughout much of the 20th century, terrible violence was inflicted in the service of secular faiths. In contrast, the organized atheism of the present century is mostly a media phenomenon and best appreciated as a type of entertainment. And I think that's spot on.
That's a perfect quote. Yeah.
Yeah, it's earlier when you had the communism and Nazism and stuff like that, terrible atrocities. Today, it's YouTube debates, and that's about the weight it should be given.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was thinking of when I read that, was just the YouTube channels where it is just the debates, and the debates aren't really very substantial. It's about getting the best quip. I mean, going back to Christopher Hitchens, that's what Christopher Hitchens did. It wasn't really a lot of substance. It was very witty quips, putting
Yeah,
people in their place.
yeah, it's very much a and I don't know too much about this whole phenomenon of the Pokemon, but these people like have these cards, and they kind of look like memes to me, or fallacies. And you
Yeah.
basically just lay one down, and then this guy lays this down, and then it's like, well, that covers up that one and this and that. So it's like a series of fallacies and memes and statements. It's not. When I was in college, you'd have a debate, and it would be about something you knew nothing about. Like, say, maybe free trade, and you'd have
Yeah.
two guys talking about it and addressing each other's points. You would go listen to both sides, probably walk away learning something from both sides, but it wasn't a who won or who lost. It was just two people presenting opposite views, opposing views, with some degree of forum and
Modicum.
structure. Yeah, and putting time limits and just asking. They would ask a question and then they would answer it, and you didn't win
Yeah.
or lose. It was just which side did you feel spoke to you, and of course different people are going to have different reactions, but or like a political debate, like on TV. It was, here's what I offer you. Then this guy, you're basically presenting yourself to the audience and selling yourself to the audience. You're not defeating your opponent. And
Yeah.
today, even in the political debates, it's really disturbing to see where it's become a contest of who wins the debate, when really it should be a way to measure candidates.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
Because the guy who wins the debate doesn't necessarily need to be running the country.
No. And I think Trump sort of proved that.
Yeah. And again, you can win debates by just, bullying your way through them. And we see that more too.
Yeah. And to be honest, that's how I see a lot of atheist debates today. It's that whole, I'm not taking a position, so I automatically win. And then just attacking the character of the other person. Well, you're delusional. You're an idiot. You don't accept facts. I will say I won't say delusional and idiots and stuff, but you can make those sort of criticisms without doing it in that sort of demeaning tone.
Yeah, and these fallacies have just become meaningless because once like appeal to authority or something like that, just if somebody, they'll ask, I've seen it where they'll say like, please cite your evidence, and then the person will present some sort of reference. They'll be like, well, that's an appeal to authority. Well, of course it is. It's kind of the point, right?
But an appeal to authority isn't always fallacious. It's a particular kind of appeal. And like you say, it's like Pokemon cards. They're just laying them down. And a lot of them don't really. It sort of shows how that's kind of taken on a religious nature.
Yeah.
Because they've learned the phrase and the ritual without learning what the actual meaning is.
Yeah. It also just occurs to me that maybe there should be an eighth type of atheist, Pokemon atheist. Because I'm not convinced that those folks are not their own atheism as well too. I always just kind of watch them from afar and on the Nature Channel. I don't. I'm not brave enough to interact with them in person.
Maybe he'll write a sequel and discuss them, or we'll write a sequel piggybacking off. I've just realized we've been going about an hour and a quarter, so we should probably end it soonish.
Yeah. I think we've covered the introduction and
the new atheism.
Yep.
I was just going to say the next chapter is a really beefy one, and one where he actually really starts to get into the flow and expand on things. So the next chapter will be the next one that we record will be dedicated solely to that chapter.
Yeah, and he definitely had sort of a flippant attitude towards new atheism. And definitely said, this is the last time I'll be talking about these guys.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of the introduction goes into the humanism, because I think at his core, that's what he's all about is the humanism thing. And just as kind of like a little teaser, I really had to kind of relook at my understanding, because I certainly didn't understand secular humanism the way he does. So I definitely had to take a new look at that, and find out why he abhors secular humanism.
Yeah, same. It's like I was saying to you before we started, it's a chapter I'm gonna have to reread and break down a little bit because there's some stuff where he talks about it in a way I didn't really recognize.
Yeah, yeah, and I think too, people just put secular humanist on their bio without even thinking about it, or what it is,
Yeah.
or what those words mean. And there again, I look forward to finding out why Mr. John Gray abhors the secular humanists.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, from what I can gather, it's very much about putting faith in humans and, still having faith. But like I said, it's something I've really got to reread and break down because I was just, rather than reading it like a philosophical piece, I read it like a novel. I was just so
Yep.
into what he was saying that I was just reading it without processing too much of it. But with works
Yep.
like that, it's kind of what you gotta do. You kinda gotta read the whole thing and then go back to it and break it down and
Yeah, I listened. No, I read it on my Kindle, but I also listened to it, and also the audible version is very good for those that prefer that. I listened to the first chapter and the introduction probably 3 times, just to really sort of grip it. And I'm glad I'll have a few days to go through the secular humanism again.
nice one. Yeah, it's, I'll go through it again over the weekend and actually take some notes, and I'll get this edited and out probably on Tuesday night. I'll set it as a premiere, and I think if we record every Thursday like we have tonight, if you have the time, I can get them edited over the weekend and have it out each Tuesday each week.
You got it.
Nice, nice. Okay, I'll let you go then, and I'm gonna head to bed as well because it's like 11 p.m. now, and I'm old and knackered and stuff. So, nice one, Rev. Thank you for joining me. I had a really good chat and a really good time.
It was my pleasure. Thank you much.
No, thank you. Good night, mate.
Good night.